Hello, and welcome to the second episode of Pondering the Orb, where we are celebrating New EDGE SWORD SORCERY Magazine in its second issue. I am your host, the wandering fantasy author JEREMY, happy again to sound the call. Of course, we are going to explore some of the great new voices on the New EDGE scene, listen to some wonderful music to rouse our heroic spirits, and then we're going to enjoy a wonderful panel with some of the authors featured in both issues number 1 and number 2. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. We'd offered prayers to Crom before we began, but he would not care. So let us set off into high adventure. Hong Kong-born Jeremy Pak Nelson is a British author residing in Manchester, with credits including stories in Solarpunk magazine and another wonderful periodical for sword and sorcery fiction, Tales from the Magician's Skull. In his story appearing in New EDGE SWORD SORCERY number 2, A Debt Forgotten, A Debt Unpaid, we follow the tale of Kai the Bloodwritten, a mysterious slave from an ancient civilization that makes a bargain with a forgotten god for his escape. Invoking the best of weird tales and featuring an ample dose of bloodshed, let's read from the enthralling A Debt Forgotten, A Debt Unpaid by Jeremy Pak Nelson. A Debt Forgotten, A Debt Unpaid by Jeremy Pak Nelson. Kai the Bloodwritten, enslaved for half a generation, lay nude in an empty Celadon bath. The exquisite porcelain tub was wide enough for 3, but Kai's bulk made it almost ordinary. A flightless catch, plumbed in dappled amethyst and lapis, leapt onto the lip of the bath. The bird observed him with a single avian eye, feathers glimmering in the lamplight. The sacred birds had free reign over the imperial palace, even in these gilded rooms where the most valuable prisoners were kept. The birds watched, but how much they understood, how much they reported, Kai did not know. He tried to learn the avian tongue, but he suspected that in his presence the birds only mocked him. Fool, fool. Servant brought him a rosewood tray lined in rich velvet. 2 exquisite daggers nestled in the fabric, their blades shaped like the broad leaves of a nabar tree, each forged from the marbled steel known for being the heirloom craft of the Penzanite Valleys, one of the Emperor's most costly conquests. Kai remembered fleeing the first siege a century ago, the searing pain of arrows in his back. "Please, good master," servant said. "It is time." When Kai took one of the daggers, perfectly balanced, its keen edges lifted fine silken threads from the velvet. With one edge of the blade, he incised into his left calf, the other his right. The dagger cut through flesh as though it were steamed cake. The cuts were so fine as to be painless. Blood beaded on his skin. Only the faintest trace of red marked the steel. He exchanged one dagger for the other. 4 edges, 4 limbs. He cut into his arms, equally practiced with either hand. Kai returned the daggers to the tray, and the movement opened his wounds. They wept crimson, and blood pooled in the Celadon vessel. Kai lay back, his head supported by the gentle memorial curve of the bath's lip. Gorged on the Empire's hospitality, he had become so large it took less of his blood to fill the bath. Or he had more of it to give. His head felt light, his neck but a kite's twine tied to his floating mind. The pulling ichor scented the room, but not with the copper reek of mortal blood, but with an ammonic sharpness. "Very good, master." Servant did not tarry. He placed the smithing molds into the tub, stacking them crosswise as though building a bonfire. Kai was always reminded of bread tins. The metal shells were filled not with hot dough, but with the alchemical sands weighed by a palace sage. 4 by 4 by 4 servants stacked them, and they reached almost to Kai's chest. Underglazed sigils gleamed at the touch of crimson. His blood was warm around his feet, his ankles, his backside, and the vessel itself woke, warmed Kai's shivering body even as the cold of blood loss crept into his bones. The cat shuffled on its perch, eyes flashing scarlet as its pupils pinned. Yet the pool of blood reached only halfway up to the bottom pans. A rumbling came through the door. Servant, bringing the final element to the bloodletting. Even through the bath's ornate scrimshawed feet, Kai could feel the turning of the heavy wheels on the floor. He was too weak to turn and look. The catch left its perch. Servant wheeled an iron frame to the bath. A cauldron hung from a bar by stout chains. Servant struggled with the weight of the construct, his chest heaving. The man had the bearing of a soldier, and though sweat slicked his forehead and neck, Servant's placid countenance betrayed none of his exertions. Once the cauldron was in position, hovering over the lip of the bath, Servant took hold of a rope on the other side. The cauldron's silvery contents caught the lamplight and cast glimmering constellations on the ceiling. Servant braced himself, tugged at the pulleyed rope, and one side of the cauldron lifted to tip its contents into the bath. Hydrogerum hit the bottom of the vessel in a cacophony of shattering stone, and the room echoed with the impact. Liquid metal splashed Kai's blood to the side of the bath, awakening more sigils to life. The blood did not mix with the quicksilver. The two co-volved in a vortex until blood frothed like scum, floating on the heavier liquid metal. Quicksilver, warmed by the arcane inscriptions laid in the porcelain, rose around Kai. A mortal man would buoy on the mixture, but instead the liquid flowed over his limbs, constraining his movement. When it rose to his chest, he felt like a prisoner shackled. Even movements required for breathing became difficult. Kai, the survivor, who fled as his peoples met doom at the hands of the vengeful men from the southern seas, who prostrated at the feet of Descender Rendithan the First. Ever the survivor, ever the coward. No more. No more. But this one last time he shall be compelled to fulfill his service. Kai willed himself open to ease the process, but it did not matter. Every fortnight, when he lay in the vessel, the gates within him opened, and however willing he was, the moment a fissure cracked the nameless portals within him, they were wrenched apart. It felt as though his ribs yearned to spread wide, like the wings of a caged bird, as though his spine grew thorns to thread through his bowels and skewer his mind. Thus Kai served as his people once did, his blood a conduit for the gods civilization had banished from the physical planes. Kai's vision grew dark. Before he lost awareness, he saw the blood-ridden surface of the quicksilver begin to roil. When he came to, the bath was being drained. A gutter cut into the floor funneled precious metal to be cleansed and reused. Servant leaned over the tub, methodically stacking the pans on the same cart that once held the cauldron. The cart creaked under the load. The sides of the pans were silvered from the hydrogerum, and its contents, once little more than dirt and ore, were now solid metal ingots, bright rippling silver and threaded with rust-colored traces of Kai's blood. Servant hefted the blood-worked alloy with frightening ease. Each of them weighed the same as half a man. Despite appearances, Servant was more than capable of subduing his prisoner. Very good, master, very good. Servant lifted another ingot. The smiths of the Exalted will be most pleased.
Wandering into a countryside manor in search of a place to rest and some food, the Gallowar Astartha stumbles into the home of her community's torturer, the sorcerer Xantros. With one swing of an axe, Astartha is certain she has found justice for her and the ones she lost. Until the despot keeps getting back up. New EDGE Sword Sorcery number 2 is proud to feature a new voice making their fiction debut. This is How Many Deaths Until Vengeance by Saskatchewan-based author June Orchard Parker.
How Many Deaths Till Vengeance by June Orchard Parker. A house appeared before her legs could demand her surrender. Standing at the intersection of the road and a gravel path, it boasted 2 stories and a brown, unpainted exterior. She paused. So far away from a city, the presence of a house on this road was unexpected. But ruminating on it would waste time. With evening dinner likely close at hand, would the owner consider hosting her for the night? Was it worth a try to ask? Did she even care to talk to other people? Trees, like the one she had slept under last night, had made more predictable and pleasant company. They sheltered her in silence, never cast a judging eye. Then again, would a tree feed her at the end of the day? Sometimes, of course, but not today. None of the trees nearby bore fruit, nor did the bushes. She picked up her feet and shuffled up the road. It wasn't customary to knock on the front door in the daytime. Most landowners had slaves who could welcome guests at any hour. Indeed, when she pushed open the door and walked through, a slave looked up from a well in the center of the courtyard. A stout, bald, and bronze-skinned man, his status indicated by his undyed tunic and a silver cuff on his left wrist. Dark circles hung under his eyes. His nose seemed wrinkled and flared, as if in annoyance. "Greetings, traveler," said the slave, his voice soft and pleasant. "I'm Petrar, head slave of Xantros. My master is washing himself now, so it would please me to assist you in his stead. May I help you?" Xantros. A chill swept through her. She clenched her jaw. In a land as vast as Aphania, many men must share his name. Besides, her home city of Epifor lay 100 miles away, if not farther. She suppressed a shudder, drew in a breath. "Call me Astartha. If it makes little difference, I would stay the night and leave in the morning. You may bring me food as well, if it pleases you or Xantros." "Certainly." Petrar's face never shifted from a disgruntled expression, though he kept his voice pleasant. "Something warm to eat, perhaps?" "I'd appreciate it. Water to drink as well." "By all means." He squinted an eye. "Pardon my asking, but would you rather stay in the women's quarters or the men's?" "The women's." "Last, were you hoping to visit Lake Agnos? We could sell you a fishing net and rod if you need one. You could also rent a boat for the evening. Not for me, Petrar, but I appreciate the offer." She smiled at the slave, which at any hour was uncustomary, for it didn't profit free people to regard slaves as equals. But in truth, anyone could end up a slave in the aftermath of war or conquest. Such knowledge ought to keep one humble, and if her smile did its other job, it kept her suspicion about Xantros off her face. Petrar led her up the wooden stairs and around the balcony to the women's quarters. He knocked before pushing the door open. "An overnight guest, just a traveler. Keep her entertained. I'll help in the kitchen tonight." The pleasantness had dropped from his voice. Ushered in, Astartha greeted the female slave, slender with saggy cheeks, her black hair streaked with silver, before striding towards the nearest stool and easing herself onto it. Her aching legs would have thanked her for the relief if they had had voices. Seated on a couch, the slave wrote into a wax tablet. "A moment, please, and we'll talk." On a corner desk, a bright candle shone, throwing light over the wooden floors and onto the walls. A tapestry across from the door showed a black figure scene of 2 hunting dogs nuzzling an orphan. Thus began the story of Varia, legendary queen of Epifor. Her life ended much later when a usurper, the so-called Queen King of Epifor, struck her down with lightning and ushered in an era of greater freedom. The longer she stared at the tapestry, the more apparent it grew that the candle on the desk burned brighter than was natural. 2 little lights streamed in from the window near the ceiling, whereas the tiny orange candle flame cast far more intense light than possible. Mundane sorcery, but sorcery all the same. The slave lowered the tablet and stylus in her hands. "Forgive me, young one, but what was your name? Petrar was rude not to introduce you." "Astartha." "I am Etra. It would please me to make your acquaintance." She spoke as if from a script, one recalled with irritating familiarity. Astartha nodded but tensed. She fondled the handle of the axe that hung from her belt. "Etra, if it pleases you, would you tell me about your master? What moved him to live out here?" "Between you and me, it's no pleasure." Etra leaned forward, setting her tablet and stylus on her lap. "Master Xantros retired from public service 4 months ago. He's grown tired of cities in his old age, so he moved out here, bringing us with him." "What public service did he perform?" Etra's eyes traveled to Astartha's axe. "Is that something you should know?" "For our mutual benefit, it is." Etra shrugged. "He served on the senior council of Epifor." Tension paralyzed Astartha's limbs. A messenger's words, half remembered, rang in her brain. By decree of Coram, our king, and by assent of the junior and senior councils, the Galay of Epifor are declared outlawed from this city. The troops shall act at once to eradicate the cult of the Galay and all of its followers, to undo their harm to the citizenry, and to restore the natural order of mankind among the people, in sight of the holy gods. Blurred visions of that day. Galay taking their own lives with daggers, their yellow robes stained red with blood, men grabbing women and throwing them from the walls. Astartha herself rushing through the dark, hidden tunnels to escape into the night. They never stopped yelling. They never stopped screaming. Her grip on her axe tightened. A storm of ice crashed through her. "Are you well?" said Etra. Astartha looked up. Her gaze had drifted to the floor. "Your master, would he still be bathing at this time?" Etra leaned forward, eyes full of concern and a hint of wonder. "I imagine so. He likes to soak his old bones for as long as he can." "Why? What's the matter?" "Astartha?" Her muscles tensed as if begging not to move, but wintry terror was melting in the savage sun of anger. Grinding her teeth, Astartha rose from her stool, straining upwards with willing sinews and tendons. Etra stood too. "Petrar didn't tell you. Master Xantros worries about guests carrying weapons in his home." "The axe is the tongue with which I'll speak to him." Astartha stormed from the woman's quarters, Etra calling out something behind her. With lightning for blood, she rounded the balcony and thundered down the wooden steps to the courtyard. "Fury, be my goddess," she whispered. For it was Fury, goddess of the wounded, who had long imbued Astartha with divine perseverance. What else in the world, who else, sustained her through all her years of torment? Who guarded her flesh? Who compelled her limbs? No deity other than Fury, no mortal other than Astartha. A fire burned within, filling her chest, rising to her face. Yet, as always, decades of pain refused to die on this pyre meant for them. Their cold knives stabbed at her bones. She slammed her shoulder against the bathroom door, to no avail. Bolted shut. With swings of her axe instead, she splintered and cracked, and at last broke through the wood. An old man's voice was calling from inside. Etra's behind her. Reaching through the hole she made, Astartha unbolted the door and shoved it open. The door swung back far enough to crack against the wall. The old man's hawk-like face, ruddy and wrinkled, his dead eyes, thin lips, expression of peripheral disdain, dressed in a blue robe with golden trim. There was no mistaking this Xantros for any other. And yet some inner force held Astartha at the threshold to the bathroom. Hope for his contrition, his remorse, anything to prevent the inevitable. Xantros tilted his chin towards her. "Good evening to you too." Astartha's lungs had all but seized up. She tried to catch her breath. The councilman's lips twitched with either amusement or contempt. "Why would one of my slaves let in someone like you? You appear rather rude and uncouth. I pray you don't ask to stay for the night." Fury at last regraced Astartha. The fire in her heart set her brain aflame, till the councilman's presence shrank before her. "You rapacious, vile, eminently murderable scum. My siblings and I suffered under the rule of your pissant king and the tyranny of your senior council. I was loved in Epifor, not only by many, but by all who mattered. You voted to ruin the lives of all the Galay there. And for what? We did nothing to you. Nothing at all." "Ah." Xantros wrung and folded his hands. "To start, I'm aware of how I voted, thank you. It pleased the king and the people I represented, did it not? Driving out perversions such as eunuchs and half-boys and Galay made for good sport. You have long needed, let us say, removal in order to strengthen our society." Twisted delight flashed in his gaze. "In the end, though, it was nothing personal. You don't need to break down my door over it. Besides, if you hated our laws, you could have thrown yourselves from the walls like your friends did." Jolted out of paralysis, sweeping into the room with iron haste and smiting him across the face with an angry fist and her axe swinging up in her other hand and crashing into his ribs, blood spurted from the councilman's nose and soaked into his robes where she had cut him. Xantros backed away, almost tripping into the bathtub. herself growling, for it was not enough, would never be enough just to hurt him, striking insatiably until Xantros crumpled, groaning and bleeding and suffering not enough for his heinous crimes against the Galley and the rest of Epifor. Astartha stomped on his head and ground it into the floor until he was dead. Dead beyond doubt, dead beyond the further reach of revenge, dead to no satisfaction. The light of the room dimmed. A lantern was hanging on the wall above the tub. Astartha nudged Xantra's corpse with her foot and stood for a moment, clarity and calm emerging from the fog of distress. Meanwhile, the councilman bled like a sacrificial bull. But rather than burn his body as an offering, Astartha would bury it in the nearest, most convenient spot. What dignity did he deserve? After death, his soul would fall through the blackness of the pit, deprived of all company but his fraying sanity. Xantros had tried, in all audacity and cruelty of spirit, to lie. Her siblings among the Galley had not thrown themselves from the walls, but had been thrown on the winds of Corum and the councils. Astartha stepped away from the corpse, trembling, and slumped against the wall. The axe in her hand, the floor under her feet, the dead vile bastard. They were real. They were of the present. The memories would one day lie as far from her as Epifor. One must have faith in the future to bear the weight of past and present. On the lower half of the opposite wall, black figure characters led each other not only towards the tub, but on a procession that heralded the start of spring. Women in their finery carried vegetables and flowers. Men dressed in animal skins wore large phalluses and pulled a sacrificial bull towards its fate. Such parades had made life in the city-state more bearable for a time. Might days of revelry be far behind her now, along with her home? She turned her head towards the door. Petrarch had dared to enter the room. He seemed restless, clueless, pacing around without saying a word. "You're emancipated," Astartha said. Petrarch did not react. At his feet, the body of Xantros started to cough and gasp. Astartha shot up. The breath escaped her lungs. The slave darted out of the room. The former corpse clung to his ribcage for a moment, then heaved himself from the floor and onto his feet. Blood still stained his clothes, but had vanished from his skin, along with his cuts and bruises. Xantros regarded her with a theatrical frown, though he never carried himself as if unbothered. "I never felt so hurt in my life, Gala. To your credit, you tried harder to hurt me than any of your friends back in Epifor. I suppose that means you still have your balls. In any case, before you get more ideas, let me impress something upon you. I will come back to life as many times as my sorcery allows. Oh, you ought to be sad, shouldn't you? To see your dream of vengeance crushed to dust?" Astartha stepped forward, and the arc of her axe answered the question. Xantros' head flew from his shoulders and slammed against the floor.
Sword and sorcery has always held a vital part of itself in historical fiction, blending memory and sorcery to startling new heights of heroics fabled in the tales of characters like Conan, Jeriel, Imrryr, and so many more. But now we turn to the music, and a story told with a fury drawn from the sorcerous depths, of rebirth and a pledge to fight again. This band are one of the best bands German melodic death metal has to offer, and it is an honor to present them as we celebrate New EDGE Sword and Sorcery No. 2. Taken from their 2022 album, Towards the Unknown, this is The Awakening by Battle Sword. Once again, we return to the Dreaming City and the New York Titans of Dark Ambient Imrryr with some of the best RPG tunes out there. This wonderful band has asked us to promote 2 charities this episode, the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund and ANERA, a non-for-profit looking to provide humanitarian aid in the region. You can find the links to these wonderful groups below in the description. No matter where we are in the world, or how we look at it, is the hope of everyone that we would pray and work to make sure that the children and their families in these places are getting as much aid and help as humanly possible. Thank you for your consideration. Imrryr gifts us again with another track from the Dreaming City 3, this time an ode to Elric's stalwart friend to the bitter end. This track is called Moonglum. We come to the end of two wonderful episodes celebrating a magazine everyone should get behind. New Edge Sword and Sorcery Magazine is a wonderful publication doing its absolute best to bring sword and sorcery into the 21st century, and Pondering the Orb supports them from here to the gates of hell. To finish our exploration of this new magazine, we're going to have a panel featuring authors published in issues number 1 and number 2. Please enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to another panel of Pondering the Orb, and we're, of course, exploring its New Edge Sword and Sorcery number 2. But I have so many great authors from New Edge Sword and Sorcery number 1 and number 2 with me here tonight. So let's begin. Let's go around the panel and introduce everyone. Kirk, let's start with you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is KIRK Johnson, KIRK A. Johnson, and I am a writer. I'm an author. I write sword and sorcery, sword and soul, and horror, weird cosmic horror. I just published a book last year, 2022, and called The Almanacs, which is right here behind me.
Mm-hmm.
You can find it anywhere. You can find it on Amazon, Nook. You can also go to BookBaby, which is where I use their services to publish it. And you can check out my website, Farfield, twolandsfarfield.com on WordPress. And you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok under KIRK A. Johnson. And on Instagram, Farfield Press.
Perfect. Everyone has to be on the dreaded TikTok. Jeremy?
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I'm Jeremy Pak Nelson. I'm currently based in Manchester, England, and I write science fiction, fantasy, among other genres. You can find my work on my website, jpaknelson.com, and that's also my social media handle for Twitter/X and everything else under the sun.
Excellent. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. Sarah A. MACKLIN. I am a fantasy author in virtually every subgenre of fantasy. I am the author of the Royal Heretic and, the Royal Heretic series. You can find it pretty much wherever books are sold, but mainly on mvmedia.com. I'm also the author of Bride of the River God, and several short stories in various publications. And I am happy to be chatting with you all.
Well, thank you, everyone, for being here. Let's get started with the first question, and Kirk, we'll start with you. Considering each of you have published Sword and Sorcery before you grace the pages of New Edge Sword and Sorcery magazine, what made you all fans of the genre in the first place? And Kirk, we'll start with you.
Real quick, Marvel's run of Conan the Barbarian and Savage Sword of Conan. That was me. That was while everybody was getting Spider-Man and X-Men and Thor and the Avengers. I was the one guy buying Conan the comics and then Warlord on DC and Eric, Son of Thunder on DC, getting all of that. And I want to say maybe that really started with my dad. Me and my dad, when my dad had like free time, but he too tired because he was working all day. We sit and we watch these sword and sandal movies from back in the day, and got into Jason. He got me into Jason and the Argonauts, and every Ray Harryhausen movie that had monsters in it. So Sinbad, Men on the Moon, First Men on the Moon, all that good stuff.
The classics. Jeremy, what about you?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I kind of came to Sword and Sorcery late in my reading life. I was a huge fantasy reader, but it was all standard stuff you would hear via word of mouth. I grew up in Hong Kong, and so, we didn't have a lot of options around in terms of, commercial or pulp fiction. So I was reading R.A. Salvatore and Robert Jordan and so on. And then when I got into grad school, my roommate was a serious, proper scholar of the weird, the writer Jonathan Helland, and he's written essays about C.L. Moore, and then he turned me on Sword and Sorcery, and then suddenly it was like seeing oh, this is where all the good stuff comes from. This is like the where the lineage has um, where fantasy, as I understood it, was kind of rooted in this alongside, the Tolkien-esque um, influences of fantasy. So yeah, that's kind of what brought me into sword and sorcery. And then as I learned more about the genre and just seeing how enthusiastic the fans are, and how we've been, patiently waiting for the great revival of sword and sorcery. It's just been fantastic being part of the community.
Fantastic. Sarah, how about you? How did you get into the genre?
In fourth grade for our uh, movie for field day, we got to watch Willow.
Oh,
And while
badass.
the rest of the class was bored, I was the one sitting there just in awe of everything because I had seen nothing like that ever in my life. And pretty much after that, I discovered the Tarma and Kethri stories by Mercedes Lakey, and from there, that was it. I just started writing every iteration of sword and sorcery, and of course I wanted to play in it, so my first character of course was a black girl who was smarter than everybody and knew it. um so that was my foray. I've just been stuck in it ever since.
That's fantastic. Let's actually dive into each of your stories. And Jeremy, let's start with you. Tell us about your story.
Yes, so my story in issue two, A Debt Forgotten, A Debt Repaid, features our large-bodied protagonist, Amkai, who's one of the few, maybe only, survivor of a people marked with this hereditary blood mark. And it indicates, way back in the past, service to a god or gods that have since kind of passed on from memory. But still, his people are historically resented for it. So he's been captured by the powers that be, and his blood is being used to manufacture weapons for the Empire. And that's kind of how the story starts.
So, like, what were the big influences when you started actually sitting down and planning out how this story would unfold for us as the readers?
Yeah, well, it's funny because Oliver does this great thing where he chats to us about our stories at whatever stage of development we want to have that talk at. And so I had an opportunity to think more about the conception of the story than I would normally do. And it was kind of a challenge of trying to stay true to that but not end up too beholden to it. And so one of the roots of where that story came from was the idea of how your relationship with your body and what it's used for, basically. And I really wanted to dive into that visceral side of sword and sorcery, of the sensory details of having your body being kind of submerged in quicksilver and mercury, and what that might feel like, and having your blood drained. And I think, yeah, that was kind of one of the ways into what does it mean if people see your body as a resource and you don't.
Well, it's a great story. Sarah, can we talk about yours?
Yes, my story is The Tears of Ebb. It follows two women, one a magician referred to as the Seeker, and another is a guard master in a regional lord's house, and they have to find the lord's daughter who has been stolen by spirits, but all is not what it seems.
Very cool. So, I'm actually a fan of your work. I'm a really big fan of Royal Heretic, and I always like what you do with magic. Can you talk for a second about how you view your use of magic in sword and sorcery, and just what do you think makes magic in sword and sorcery unique in your opinion?
Magic and sword and sorcery. I like dealing with magic and sword and sorcery a lot better because it gives me a chance to be more creative with the spells. If While there are more rules, there are also less rules.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you can have more of the evil wizard turns himself into a giant snake. You could just have him join Jafar from Aladdin stuff. But just come up with a reason why, and he has a magic stone. Everybody accepts it, as opposed to when I write like Mage Punk, it's like, but there's science behind it. So exactly how did he do that?
Right.
But I can play more when I'm writing in sword and sorcery, which is something I love and get to be so much more creative. And I like just what Jeremy was talking about. Oliver got me to push a lot of the weirdness of the magics in that story. Because honestly, I had been playing it a little safe. So since we do get to go into the spirit world, it's like, how does it smell? How does it taste? How does it feel to be in, a world that is on a layer with our own, but absolutely not our own?
And it's an excellent tale. Kirk, let's talk about Carnivora.
So Carnivore is set in a time before metal, still a Stone Age world. And the war chief of a raiding clan has big dreams about becoming more than just a raiding clan, with big ideas, until he runs into a woman and the entire world changes forever.
And it's
called Carnivora. And that is Carnivora.
It is a horrifying story. It's truly a scary story. And I was talking recently to another author friend of mine that it's not easy to scare me, but there's some things in that story that are truly creepy, especially the flies, but I don't want to ruin that for anyone. But I have to ask you, Sword and Sorcery has such a unique relationship with horror. And I was wondering, like, just like I asked Sarah about the balance of magic in Sword and Sorcery, where do you think the balance of horror in Sword and Sorcery lies? Because they've always been interesting kind of bedmates with each other.
Right. It's interesting. I do remember reading, I can't remember where, and listening to a couple of podcasts talk about, actually reading that Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft were like pen pals, and H.P. Lovecraft, pushing Robert to go even weirder into his stories and stuff of the nature, and Robert E. Howard even writing some horror and some weird horror stuff. So I think it's, horror can go really. There's so many different levels of horror already. Like it's not just weird horror. You have monster horror, you have splatterpunk, you have all these other like realms of horror that can play into be a part of the Sword and Sorcery. Sword and Sorcery being like an action-packed kind of action adventure in ancient times, right? And that is such a simple kind of description for it, that you can bring so many different elements of other genres into it. Right. You can play with Sword and Sorcery and the Western element of cowboys and Indians. You can play with that. Howard did play with that already. You can play with the weird horror part of it and going insane, which also was played up with not just Robert E. Howard, but also with Fritz Leiber. And Jack Vance doing some strange things, as well as Clark Ashton Smith, was before Robert E. Howard. So I think if really, like we all have to do as authors, do a good job in developing that horror and putting that and making that part of the story, and get a great solid story. Right. And I hope that answered the question where horror is going. That's where horror is going.
That's a great answer.
It's going crazy places.
Right. And it's committing to it. So this is our final question. Sarah, we'll start with you. And of course, thank you all again for taking part in this panel. I'd like to ask each of you, when you think about New EDGE Sword and Sorcery Magazine and where it's trying to push SNS into a more diverse and open field for authors to write in, what do you hope readers take away from these magazines? And of course, Sarah, we'll start with you.
Well, the biggest things, sword and sorcery doesn't have to be in some, let's just say, deciduous forest somewhere in Western Europe, or if we want to be exotic, maybe some grassland somewhere. Um, Sword and sorcery can be anywhere. It can involve anyone. It can involve any gender. It can involve any, sexual orientation, any milieu. Just expand your imagination. I mean, there's so many tales, so many mythologies, so many cultures to play with. Um, uh, the new series by Rebecca Roanhorse that starts off with Black Sun blew my mind as to what can be done with fantasy of that sort of era. And it's like there's so many stories that can be told, and the more inclusive we can get, the better the genre is going to become.
Absolutely. Kirk?
Yeah, I mean, to piggyback off of what Sarah had said, absolutely. It's you know, feel free to not limit yourself to so many to your imagination. Don't limit your imagination. Just explore the wonder of developing civilizations and ancient times and magic and unknown things. Just play with it. It's such a great genre that damn you gatekeeping publishers for not seeing how great it is and how still great it is. That's why we have independence. So that's I think that's the beauty of what I think people will come out with after reading this, that I can imagine even more than what I thought was possible, and I can enjoy and play and find the wonder in it. And that's and hopefully they'll see somebody with enough resources can see it as, hey, this should be on Amazon.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Jeremy.
Yeah, I can only agree with Kirk and Sarah. I think Sword and Sorcery still has this kind of mustiness of texts from almost a century ago, right? But
Yes.
it's so much more than that. And the fact that the genre from the get-go has been rooted in, almost more realistic depictions of humanity and morality makes it so relevant to where we are today, right? And I mean, as far as what I'd hope for readers, I want them to open up an issue and just be surprised. Like, sure, I want them to find a home. Like, this is familiar, this is Sword and Sorcery, but never did they imagine that they would see something like this. I want to be surprised when I open these pages, right? Because that's what diversity brings. Like, you can't anticipate what will happen when you bring in something new and see what happens, what the alchemy of new influences will bring. And that's what I'm really excited about.
Great answer. Thank you all so much for joining me for this panel. It's been great having you. I truly enjoyed all the stories, but you three in particular, I think really wowed me. And I was very lucky to be able to get all three of you. So thank you for giving up your time. Kirk, where can we find you one more time?
you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, Farfield Press, TikTok as well, under Kirk Johnson. You can find the Albinox collection of short stories on Amazon. You can find on Nook, Barnes and Nobles, and any other and all other ebook devices and platforms.
Fantastic. Jeremy?
I've got links to my work on jpaknelson.com, and that's where you'll also find me on Twitter and all the other social media platforms out there.
Sarah?
On Instagram, you'll find me at Sarah_Macklin. But you'll mostly see my art there because I also do comics. But you'll find me on Blue Sky and on the site that used to be Twitter as Killian Fantasy.
Perfect. Everyone, thank you so much for joining me. Everyone at home, thank you. Please explore New Edge Sword and Sorcery Magazine number 1 and 2. The links are below in the description. I'm Jay Reckward, the Wandering Fantasy author from Pondering the Orb. Safe journeys, everyone. Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And before we go, you can find New Edge Sword and Sorcery Magazine issues number 1 and 2 below in the description. Please check out and support this wonderful new publisher and their magazine. I'm the Wandering Fantasy author Jay Reckward, and thank you so much for joining me. Safe journeys.